8,000 rushing yards, almost 5,000 receiving yards. And the thing that got me was I didn't realize this till we had him on the show, but he played, 11 years, Matt? 3 different teams. Yeah. Every one of those teams made the playoffs every year he was with them.
That's right.
You know,
yeah, he was a great player, and he gets overlooked. You know, he was great in big games. He could do it all, you know, but I would also argue for a guy like Chuck Foreman. You know, some of these guys just get lost over time, and, you know, there's got to be a better selection process.
Well, I think Foreman's biggest problem may have been to just playing 7 years. I mean, if you look at him, his career total for rushing yards is like 5,000 yards.
Yeah.
But he definitely was a great player. All right, we'll bring this to my favorite player that I think should be in, and I'm sure Matt knows where I'm going with this one, which would be Eddie Metter, 6-time Pro Bowler, all-60s decade team, still holds, I think, 5 or 6 Rams records to this day. And when they bring up guys that, you know, have a chance to get in, his name isn't even brought up. I mean, he was an undersized cornerback / safety, played on those Rams teams. The thing that got me about Eddie Metter, which I didn't know till I interviewed him, was you had George Allen, one of the best defensive coaches in the history of football. You had the fearsome foursome, you know, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, defensive line of all time. And the guy that was the captain of that defense, named by George Allen, was Eddie Metter. And I know that Matt didn't know a lot about Eddie until we had him on the show. What's your opinion on Eddie?
Oh, man. Are you asking me or Brian?
You.
Well, I would definitely agree that anybody who's got records that are team records that are standing as long as they are probably belong in, especially when you consider how good that defense was. You know, it wasn't just the fearsome foursome. You know, in his 60s, it catered to defense. And when you got one of the best defensive players on one of the best defensive teams not in, I think what happens is, you know, it's like Lombardi's Packers. I think the selection process says, there's just too many of them. We can't put Jerry Kramer in. Steelers, there's just too many Steelers. We're not going to put L.C. Greenwood in. You know, too many Niners. We're not going to put Roger Craig in. I think that's just what happens over time. We took care of the fearsome foursome. We honored that team, and we're going to move on. And Eddie Metter deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. There's no question. His body of work stands for itself.
The thing that got me was what Merlin Olsen said about him. He said, Eddie Metter was one of the finest defensive backs I have ever seen. Outstanding in coverage, fierce tackler. He had a remarkable nose for the football that allowed him to come up with big plays again and again during his career with the Rams. He was also a fine leader and one of my favorite teammates. And the thing is this, I mean, the guy made 6 or 7 Pro Bowl teams. He was, if not the best defensive back of the 60s, he's in the top 3. How can that not be there? 46 career interceptions. That's a record still for the Rams. Most opponents' fumbles recovered, 18, still a record. Most blocked kicks for a career, 10, still a record. Most fumbles recovered from an opponent in the season, 5, still a record. Most blocked kicks in 1 year, 4, still a record. So I don't know, Brian, did you remember who Eddie Metter was?
No, I didn't until actually you had told me about him, and I looked him up, and I mean I agree with what you guys are saying, you know, without a doubt. Which, you know, always leads to the question, you know, with guys like this is, you know, I mean, because I don't know, so I'm asking you guys with the Hall of Fame is, I mean, is there a, you know, selection committee for, you know, like I think Major League Baseball has, you know, the Veterans Committee and that kind of thing? I mean, is that something that, you know, the NFL Hall of Fame has? Because, you know, again, and you guys are right, these guys get forgotten about when, in actuality, I mean, there are guys that are going into the Hall of Fame in front of them that don't deserve it. So that's something I've wondered. I mean, is there a you know, like a veterans committee or something?
Well, I think there is a senior committee, but I think they only take one a year, don't they, Matt?
Yeah, that's the thing. You know, they basically, you know, you look at a guy like Ken Stabler and how this process works. Ken Stabler was one of the best quarterbacks. You know, I don't know that he's necessarily top 10. And sometimes maybe, sometimes not. Not sure really where he falls. But they wait until he dies to enshrine him. And the guy probably deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. And, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame because you get these people's families. Now they got to go accept for him. I mean, Kenny Stabler didn't have the greatest stats of all time, but kind of like Terry Bradshaw. In big games, Kenny Stabler played big.
Right.
I'm sure Brian can attest to that. The Steelers and Raiders battled back and forth the entire decade of the 70s. I mean, he didn't look pretty doing it, but he got it done.
And to me, that's, when you talk about quarterbacks in the NFL, I mean, sometimes I think that's a big thing is, you don't have to be pretty, but the bottom line, if you're winning, especially Super Bowls and things like that, I mean, there's the criteria to me, I mean, there has to be a better criteria than what they do now, because I think there's a lot of guys that are deserving that are not in. I think there are guys that are in, like I said, because it's not because of their stats, it's because of an iconic view. And I think you have to have both. Yes, your stats as a career, very important. But with that, I mean, if you play big on the big stage, that has to carry weight too. I think unfortunately we as we're seeing, there's too many guys that don't have the stats, but because of the iconic view, they're in, and that creates the issue that we have. There's guys that deserve to be in that are not.
Yeah, and you got guys like Eddie Vedder, Robert Brazil, who are, like I said, they don't thump their chest. They just let what they did speak for themselves. But for some reason, the people that need to hear it don't hear it. I'll tell you, another perfect example is this. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but when you think of the New York Sack Exchange of the late 70s, early 80s, who's the first person everybody thinks of? Mark Gastineau.
Gastineau, yep.
But you had a guy in Joe Klecko who made the Pro Bowl at all three defensive line positions, nose tackle, defensive end. He was a far superior player to Mark Gastineau, and I think he's one of the best defensive linemen that ever lived. But yet he never gets mentioned either. I mean, what's your thoughts on Joe Klecko, Brian?
Yeah, it's funny because when you think of the New York Sack Exchange, the guy that doesn't immediately come to mind to me was he was so much better than the guy that comes to mind. But you're right. I think again, and there's another issue with the selection committee is because people that select and these writers it's the guys that thump their chest that stay in that spotlight to get selected, but guys with who were true football players did their job, did it right, like certainly he did, and a lot of guys that we've mentioned. Those guys, they get forgotten about. But I mean, he absolutely, to me, was one of the he was the better defensive lineman out of those two.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, Marty Lyons might have been better than Mark Gastineau also. But the thing that got me is Anthony Munoz. I think we all can agree, probably the best left tackle to ever play the game. Said in his 13 seasons, Joe is right there at the top of the defensive ends. I had to block. He said the only guys that are even in his conversation with him are Fred Dean, Leroy Selman, and Bruce Smith. He said that Klecko was the strongest guy he ever had to face, and he had perfect technique. I mean, I don't think you can get a better opinion from somebody that would know than Anthony Munoz on that.
Well, that's why a lot of these guys need to be involved in the process. We all know it's never going to change. They're never going to.
No.
It's never going to change. But anybody that knows NFL history and cares about this sort of thing, I mean, I would go the route of Jerry Kramer. There's no way that you can argue that he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame based on the way that the Hall of Fame is. The criteria that's set. How does the guard of the 50th anniversary team, every other person that's on the 50th anniversary team is in the Hall of Fame. There's only one guard on that team, and that's Jerry Kramer. How is Jerry Kramer not in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I think he wrote that book and pissed a bunch of people off, didn't he?
That's just it. It's not has nothing to do with his play on the field, with his accomplishments. He kicked 3 field goals in the 1962 championship game. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that he was the kicker, the early part of the Lombardi's Packers. He was responsible for the game-winning points in that game in really cold weather. There's just no reason that you could possibly give for him not being in, other than the fact that he got some reporters angry.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I interviewed another one the other day, really similar to Eddie Metter, which was Lamar Parrish. Lamar Parrish made it to 8 Pro Bowls in 10 years. I mean, he had 47 interceptions in 10 years. He averaged 5 interceptions a year. You know, he scored 13 return touchdowns. He had 3 separate games where he had 2 return touchdowns in a single game, but yet he never gets mentioned either. But and then Kenny Riley, who I think is still like 3rd or 4th all time in interceptions, which I know interceptions isn't necessarily the most important thing for a DB, but
it's pretty important.
Everybody up around him's there. So you got any more, Brian, that should be in or shouldn't be?
You know, we've covered a lot of my major, my major ones. One going back to running back, I don't know if we really mentioned, but Terrell Davis.
Yes.
Yeah, Terrell Davis.
Why is he not in?
Short career.
I agree that's why, but at the same time, if the criteria, if the criteria is the body of work, I mean, his body of work in the time he played, I mean, was, unbelievable. I think he's a guy that deserves to be there.
Yeah, I completely agree on Terrell Davis. I mean, it's supposed to be for the best players in the NFL, and he's one of the 10 best running backs that ever lived, I think.
Yeah. If he had stayed healthy, there's no question. I mean, he probably could have
even though he didn't stay healthy, those 3 or 4 years he was healthy, he was as good as anybody that ever lived.
Yep.
I mean, similar to Gale Sayers, only Gale Sayers got to play 6 or 7 years, and he played in Chicago, which helps also. There's a ton of Denver Broncos that at least have an argument about getting in there that aren't in there.
Right.
But and I'll tell you another one that should not be there is George Preston Marshall. I know you all might think I'm nuts, but he was the Washington Redskin owner, and he was a racist piece of shit.
Oh, yeah, the racist owner. Yeah,
he's a racist piece of shit. He said in the 50s when they asked him why he didn't sign any black players, he said, we'll start signing Negroes when the Harlem Globetrotters start signing whites. Everybody knows white people can't play basketball. And then, on top of that, he was the last owner to sign a player in 1962 that was an African-American, and that was by force because Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time, forced him to sign him because if he wouldn't have, they weren't going to build a brand-new stadium for him in the District of Columbia. That is the only reason he's finally signed an African-American player in 1962. So I just had to get that off my chest. And that's everybody was out there that screamed Larry Bird at the same time. Yeah, there was one guy. All right. All right, we got Brian Schmidt on here. Brian, you want to tell everybody about the Canadian Football League weekly show you're going to have coming up?
Yeah, very excited. We're going to have a CFL weekly show. We're going to have, guests as much as possible. A lot of players that are in the league, and then also working with getting forward players, getting GMs, really everything, and just to, there's a lot of American fans that are fans of the CFL, but unfortunately there's not a lot of information about the CFL down here in the South, below the Canadian line. So we're certainly going to help on a weekly basis to keep people informed, have guests, and really try to promote the game, and also people that enjoy the game, be able to give them more information. So.
Yeah, we're going to make Matt start watching the CFL too because he's never.
Hey, Matt's going to watch the CFL on his own volition. I admit to I've not watched, but I've had now a few people describe it to me, and I've always respected it because I know it's still pro football, and there has been a number of good players that have come out of there. I've just never watched it, but I'm going to watch it this year.
Well, I've been telling you about this for a decade, and you're just now going to learn.
A decade. We've known